presentation on issues of ethnicity and nationalism. Matthew is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Cornell University. He's also a former senior fellow at CPS and also KO multi-grant fellow. He's been conducting research in Chiang Mai, in Bangkok, in Laos, as well as in Cambodia. So his research is really one of a kind, actually, because it's really looking into the chronicles of the 18th and 19th centuries about issues at the start of ethnicity and the beginning of feelings of nationalism and how the Khmer became really considered as such. So this presentation here is really the result of quite some months of fieldwork, not only in Cambodia but also in different places of Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, in Thailand and in Laos. So the floor is yours, and after the presentation we'll probably have a few Q&As for you. Thank you, Matthew, for the presentation.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm glad to see that there are people interested in what sometimes seems to be a little bit of a narrow topic. So I'm glad to see that people in Cambodia are coming to hear me talk about this. Maybe we're all of the same type. This is actually even more narrow than my PhD dissertation topic. As Gutsana mentioned, I've been doing work in Thailand, in northern Thailand, a little bit in Laos, as well as Cambodia. And I really started my work in Bangkok. And I've expanded it a bit to Cambodia and some of these other places that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries sort of formed an area that used more or less a common set of political vocabulary. And I don't want to, I'm trying my very best not to assume that all of these places, Thailand, Cambodia, northern Thailand, thought of things in exactly the same way in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But I think that there are some patterns, and I'd like to mention some of them today. This presentation is a look at, basically it's a close look at 4 chronicle texts that were written in Cambodia, originally in Khmer. Some of them, 2 of them only survive in Thai translation. So I'm going to explain some of the complications that will cause us a bit later. And then the other 2 survive. One of them is just in Khmer, and then one is, there's a couple different versions in different languages. But I've also, for my research, I've also looked a little bit at poetry. I've looked at some law texts in Khmer and in other languages. And so I'm hoping to be able to draw together a wider variety of genres in my dissertation. But I wanted to present to you a bit of a narrower topic because I could organize it a bit better before I leave to write my dissertation next week. I'll try to speak clearly, but if I'm not making sense, or if you can't understand what I'm talking about, please feel free to stop me or interrupt or ask questions. So today, this is the general outline of the talk. I tried to put useful information on the slides so that to help us all stay on the same page. So this is what I hope to do today. First, I want to talk a little bit about some theory about ethnicity that helps me understand the materials, the sources that I've been looking at. Second, I want to talk a little bit about ethnonyms. Those are ethnic names like Khmer, Thai, Lao, Yuan. And I'll talk a bit about their multiple and shifting meanings. So I'll talk in some more details about that next. Then I want to give you some details about the 4 chronicle texts that I'm going to be looking at today. And finally, the bulk of the presentation is to look at the characteristics and the meanings that I think are implied by the uses of these ethnonyms in each chronicle text. Finally, there'll be a bit of a summary of my findings, of some patterns that I've noticed. And at the end, some reflections on the relationship between what I call state ethnicity, which I'll explain later, and the nation. So a lot of people ask me, oh, what does your presentation have to do with ideas of nationalism and the nation? So it's a good question. It's a difficult one. So I'm going to talk about that a little at the end. So ethnicity is very difficult to define. And if you're hoping to get a clear definition from me, you're going to be disappointed. Because this whole talk really is about how meanings of ethnic terms are multiple and they change over time. There's a lot of tensions in the ways that people have struggled to define ethnicity. Sometimes people and scholars debate among themselves about whether ethnic groups are defined more by who we are or more by who we are not. Hello. So that's a common tension in the ways that people think about ethnicity. Another common tension is people disagree a lot about whether ethnic identities are passed down to us from our elders, from previous generations, or are they shaped by our context? I think the easy answer for both of these is it's both. It both defines who we are and who we are not. It's also something that's partially passed down to us from prior generations and partially shaped by our context. But looking into the details, I think are interesting, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I want to mention to you the idea of markers. Markers are the clues, the signs that people use to argue that this person is Khmer, or that person is Thai, or this person is French. They can vary widely from place to place and time to time. People use different kinds of markers to differentiate who they are and who they are not. So they can include language, religion, political affiliation or nationality, physical characteristics, clothing, ways of life, all kinds of things. Some scholars even include racial or national categories as particular kinds of ways of thinking about different ethnicities. So these ways of defining, in certain places, in certain times, there's different ways of defining who is part of my ethnic group and who is not. And so these are referred to as markers. And so in some of the texts that I've seen, they say, okay, well, Yuan people dress like this. And so that's an example of somebody saying that this marker, how they dress, is what shows us that they are Yuan people. By the way, I use the word Yuan. I know it's a bit of a rude term, a slur today in Khmer, but it's the only term used to refer to Vietnamese people in all of the texts that I'm reading. And so I don't mean to imply that it's a slur, or I don't want to insult anyone. And so I want to make sure that that's clear. But I also think it's confusing to call people Vietnamese when Vietnamese actually refers to a modern category that's different than the ways that the word Yuan was used in the past. So I hope that that's all right. If anyone feels bad about it, please tell me later and I'll change. The third point is I've talked a bit about it already, but ethnic identifications can be flexible and ambiguous. Just like you could say, I have Cham friends in Cambodia who sometimes they call themselves Cham and sometimes they call themselves Khmer, depending on who they're talking to and why. I have Khmer friends who now live in Thailand or the United States, and sometimes they call themselves Americans, sometimes they call themselves Khmer. Their children may be referred to in different ways by different people. Sometimes people may speak a different language as their family tongue than their nationality. So there's a variety of ways in which today social categories that we think of as ethnic or national can be ambiguous. They can be confusing. They can be used in different ways by different people for different reasons. And so one of my main findings is that this is not new. Ambiguity, confusion, or the political uses or positioning of oneself in a system of social categories is actually old. It's very common in the texts that I will show you from the late 18th and early 19th centuries as well. So anyone who says that the complexity or the political nature of ethnicity is, for example, a colonial invention, I think that that's not supported by the sources that I'll be showing you today. On the other hand, people can't just say, they can't just say whatever they want. I can't say, I'm African, or I'm Russian or something like that, because there's a common set of shared assumptions about what ethnicity means between the speaker and an audience. And they may not believe you if you say those things. So usually changes in the way that ethnic groups or social classifications are constituted, the changes in who's included in each group, usually those changes happen gradually, or maybe the markers change rather than happening dramatically. And the one more important point that I want to mention, which is the second to last, is that sometimes it's more useful to think of references to ethnicity as an argument, as an assertion. If I want to say that, that village is a Cham village or a Khmer village, it's me making a name for that group. Other people may agree or disagree, but you can see it as a kind of action. It does not prove that those people are actually Cham. What I mean to say is that in the sources and the chronicle texts that I'm looking at, when we see somebody say, well, this is a Thai army, or that's a Vietnamese or Yuan village, that people may be using political considerations to define social categories. And not everyone might have agreed with them at that time. So I think sometimes it's useful to talk about, instead of identities, which may come with the implication that everybody agrees that this is somebody's identity, instead maybe we can use the kind of verb form of making an identification. That means I am identifying somebody else as something, which they may agree with or not. But the last point that I want to make is that I'm trying not to let my own biases either from the United States or from academia or from the 21st century, I'm trying not to let that guide or force me into certain understandings of the texts that I'm looking at. So that's easier said than done, but that's a guiding principle. So I want to talk a little bit about ethnonyms, because I'll be using this word a lot today. An easy definition of an ethnonym is an ethnic name. It's not a very helpful definition, I know. But since there are no clear definitions of any of these terms in any of the sources I'm looking at, and because the categories are constantly shifting and the groups by certain terms are changing, it's rather difficult to actually come up with a clear definition that isn't contradicted by certain cases. However, looking at chronicle texts, sometimes you can infer who is referred to by ethnonyms. And this is the sort of the art of the project. This is helped a little bit by a lot of Southeast Asian languages, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that usually attach ethnonyms to nouns. So they'll say something like Prachiachon Khmer or Grosa Thai or Dot Yuan or Srok Khmer, something like that. So you get a certain idea of what sorts of nouns, what sorts of groups or objects are attached to ethnic groups. And by tracing the sorts of nouns that are attached to ethnonyms over time and from place to place, I think that that's given me some ideas of the shifting meanings of what ethnonyms refer to. So the two main arguments that I want to make are the fourth and fifth points here. It's possible to differentiate, I think, references to Khmer, for example, or Thai or Yuan, as a cultural description, and differentiate that from referring to the same or similar set of ethnonyms, but referring to a political affiliation. So, for example, Khmer referring to particular individuals or a language or a calendar or families or a village, versus talking about a Khmer country, Khmer nobles, Khmer people, an army, which is really referring to a political group. Now you'll notice that all of these political groups, sometimes called Khmer, actually were rather diverse in reality. The army actually included a lot of people speaking Khmer and speaking Lao and speaking Cham and speaking other languages, as did the populations of Phnom-Penh and all around Cambodia. So I think it's significant that a group that actually may have spoken many languages, that may have actually practiced many different different religions or different cultural attributes, may have started at some point to just be called with an ethnic name or ethnonym, referring to them as a political group. So I call that state ethnicity, which is an association of a state and its institutions with an ethnic group, even if the actual people who are members of that state or institutions are actually rather diverse. And the argument that I make was state ethnicity was rare before the 18th century, the late 18th century, but it became very common by the beginning of the 19th. And the second major argument I want to make is that it's important to pay attention to the difference between exonyms and autonyms. An exonym is what you call other people or other groups. An autonym is what you call yourself or your own group. And so the second argument that I want to make is that, especially for assertions of state ethnicity, exonyms were common before autonyms. In other words, people started calling that army Thai, that country Yuan, before they started calling this country Khmer and this army Khmer. So these are the four chronicle texts that I want to look at today. Most of the details about chronicle dates, like the dating of the compositions of different parts, their kind of factual accuracy, influences, content, and so on. A lot of these details come from a dissertation done by Michael Vickery in the 70s. If you're really interested in looking at chronicles in great detail, you can take a look at this dissertation. It's rather confusing to read, I have to admit. But there's been nothing done in such an analytical way, looking at kind of trying to trace influences and changes between this copy of this chronicle and that copy of this chronicle, and translations and so on since then. So if you're interested, you could take a look at that, and I can give you a copy if you don't have one. So the first two of these chronicle manuscripts the first one only survives in Thai translation. It was a gift of King Ong Eng of Cambodia to the King Rama I in Thailand in 1796. It was promptly translated into Thai. And now the Khmer version is lost, unfortunately. The content covers just a brief period from the 14th to the early 15th century, according to the dates in the chronicle. Michael Vickery argues that most of the actual facts are not accurate if you compare them to inscriptions or from information from foreign sources. Some of the names and dates came from other periods of time, and they were just given new years, either accidentally or on purpose, and so on. But for our purposes, it's still interesting. I want to emphasize that even though the content covers the 14th and 15th century, the actual chronicle was written much later, probably in the middle of the 18th century. The second one, there's a shorter, it's still about 70 pages, but there's a shorter version in Thai translation that has been said to be the same version, almost the same as a manuscript at the EFEO in France, which I haven't been able to see yet. So most of my comments on this will be pending actually looking at the fuller version, which is in Khmer, not in Thai translation in France. The content of this covers the late 16th to the early 17th century. Michael Vickery says that some parts of it are more accurate than other versions in terms of the factual information about people and dates and stuff. The third one is often called the Nong Recension. The Nong Recension. It was composed in 1818, but we don't have any copies from earlier than apparently there's a Vietnamese translation in the late 1830s, but I can't find it. And even if I could, I can't read it. But other than that, there's the earliest version that we have available that I know of is a 1855 translation into Thai. There's also Khmer versions from the 1860s, which are in France. I think one has been published. And the fourth chronicle is the Nobarot recension, which was composed in 1878. Most of the content of that was copied from an earlier version, but he added a part at the end covering most of the 19th century up until 1866. So I'm looking at that last part, which he composed new, or it looks like he composed new. I want to just mention briefly, because a few people, I hope this writing is not too small. Some people may see it as problematic to use the Thai translations rather than using the Khmer originals. I don't think it's actually that problematic for these reasons. And they boil down to the fact that I think Thai translations are actually more accurate or more faithful to the version that they're translating than later editions of Khmer Chronicles, which edited the earlier editions quite a lot. I think that both Thai chronicle writers and Khmer chronicle writers shared similar. They had different sympathies, of course, but they shared a similar understanding of the political structure of their world, of the proper relationships between kings, of the role of the people and the nobles and officials in the state. And it's my argument also they shared similar visions about whether ethnicity had anything to do with politics or not. And my studies of Thai chronicles indicate that the same or very similar sets of patterns in transitions in the use of ethnonyms in Thai chronicles and Khmer chronicles are very similar. There's also a lot of evidence that both Thai chronicle writers and Khmer chronicle writers used the other chronicles as sources. So there are major portions, especially of the Khmer chronicles, that appear to have been copied from, or at least inspired by, the events in Thai chronicles. But there's also some evidence going the other way as well. So not only do Thai and Khmer chroniclists share similar worldviews and share certain understandings of political relationships, but they also use similar sources. There's a lot of records of Khmer officials when they went to Bangkok, bringing back both Thai chronicles and Khmer language chronicles from Bangkok as well. I think that's enough for now. Okay, so the first chronicle fragment I'd like to talk about now is the oldest one. It's not very long. It's about 8 pages long. In the content, there's several interactions between the royal court of Ayutthaya and the one at Loet, or Cambodia. And there's also 3 invasions of Cambodia by Ayutthaya mentioned, and 1 invasion in the reverse direction. The important point is that in all of these discussions of the relationships between the king of Cambodia and the king of Ayutthaya, there's no mention of anyone being Thai or Khmer. I argue that it was not seen as important or relevant because I'm not saying that people didn't understand ethnicity, or I should say, people didn't recognize forms of ethnicity at that time, but they didn't see it as being relevant politically. It was understood before the 18th century that all these kingdoms, and especially Cambodia, Siam, had a variety of peoples within them. Usually the same sets of people within all of these kingdoms, even if they spoke a different major language to communicate with each other. But that a good king would have a variety of peoples as his subjects. And so saying that all of his subjects were Thai or all of his subjects were Khmer was kind of defeated that point, that purpose. So instead, relations between the kingdoms are treated as very personal. This king felt this way about that king. There are some ethnic units within armies that are mentioned, which makes sense because a lot of ethnic groups had specialties and were assigned by kings to certain roles in the economy or in the military. But the last point that I want to point out to you from this text is that there is a war described between Cambodia and the Cham. And this is treated differently than the conflicts between Cambodia and Ayutthaya because the war between Cambodia and the Cham, they don't really talk about a kingdom of the Cham. They don't talk about a state, a Cham state. They talk about Cham as an ethnic group, and the Cham attacking Cambodia. So in contrast with describing the relationship between Ayutthaya and Cambodia, which was personal, the relationship between Cambodia and the Cham was based on ethnic categories. So I'll give you some examples here. So these are, the second and the third paragraph are quotations from this chronicle, which I've translated roughly into English. Both of them are about conflicts between Ayutthaya and Cambodia. And you don't have to read the whole thing, but the point is that they talk about the relationships, the conflicts, as personal. They name specific people, kings, princes, officials. They talk about their personal disagreements and personally what they did to fight against each other. You'll see that they brought their troops here, they brought their troops there, they brought their troops here, they brought their troops there. But they usually don't mention who the troops were. The troops were just like the people, sort of props in the narration of these events. That's in contrast with the description of the conflict with the Cham, which in this text are called Cat. Cat probably referred to Muslims or Malay. It's unclear whether they're talking about a group that were both Malay and Cham, or partly Malay and Cham, or if they were talking about a group that was sort of mixed, or if they were talking about the Kak who were Cham, as in like a subset. Linguistically, it's difficult to distinguish that in this text. I'm not exactly sure why the Cham were treated differently than Ayutthaya. I think it was for one of two reasons. First of all, Maybe when this text was written, the Cham didn't have a kingdom anymore, or at least didn't have a strong one anymore, and so they were not really thought of as having a state anymore. That's the first possibility I can think of. The second possibility I can think of is that the Cham, because they might have adhered to a different religion or different cultural practices, unlike Khmer and Thai, who shared many cultural practices and shared a common religion, they might have been seen as foreign in a different way. And so I think that's also a possibility. And if you have any other ideas, you can let me know. A third possibility is that this passage was inserted later, and it was a later composition, and then the other parts were written earlier.
Is it possible that it is disparaging? The Cham being viewed as being some sort of savage without a state, without a head of state, therefore not, worth mentioning as the equal
yes, I think so.
enemy. Mm-hmm. You could almost do reference with what happened in British Chronicles in the Middle Age, with attacks from the German.
Right.
Yes,
I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, this is if you refer to the enemy with the head of state of the enemy, then he's actually on a par with you, and he's a dignitary, and it gives you a certain social status too. There are two kings fighting each other. Well, when you mention the whole group without a precise name or a precise head of the group, then it is not just savagery, it's not just a group of people with no culture and ethic, and not worth really mentioning.
I think that's exactly right, and it makes me remember a point that I haven't made yet, which is that the groups most commonly referred to with ethnonyms in these early chronicles are non-state peoples, like not just Cham. In this example, it's Cham, but it's also Chong people, or in Thai chronicles, it's also Gariang, which is Karen people. In Lao chronicles, often, but also in other chronicles, it's Ka people, which are referring to sort of mountain people, non-state people. And so I think that's right also. Also, if there's a rebellion within a kingdom, and that rebellion can be associated with a particular ethnic group, again, it's a non-state people. It's a minority group within a kingdom. But in those cases, they're also referred to ethnically. So I guess the point I would like to make is that there's a distinction here between the ways that people who are associated with states are discussed and people who are not associated with states. And to say that it's disparaging, I think is exactly right, because one of the whole points of writing these chronicles for all of these Southeast Asian kingdoms is as an accoutrement, as a proof of the legitimacy and the greatness of the king. And so the whole logic of chronicle writing was to differentiate the people of the state from people who are non-state people, I think. Did I skip on? Okay, so the second text that I would like to look at is the Pre-colonial manuscript, which was given by a high-ranking noble from Cambodia to the Thai king in 1808, and it was promptly translated into Thai. And again, the Khmer version is lost, although we have what is supposed to be a similar version in France. This one is much longer. It's about 70 pages long in the version that I looked at. I think there's some debate about which parts of the text were written at what time and so on. But we can be sure that it was all written before 1808, of course. There are some parts that look to me to be older than others, and the reason I say that is because they treat Ayutthaya differently. There's one example which I'll give, which treats Ayutthaya, the relations between Cambodia and Ayutthaya in a similar way as the other version that I showed you, as a personal relationship between kings. And then there's other parts of this text where it starts to talk about state ethnicity. It starts to assign Ayutthaya the ethnicity of Thai, as that's that kingdom's ethnic group. There's no identifications of Cambodia as Khmer in this text, but there are mentions of some of these non-state people that you mentioned, such as Kat, Cham, Lawa, Karen, some of which are probably not even accurate. It was probably not the case that there were actually Karen people living in Cambodia at the time, but that somebody was confused later when they were rewriting this, possibly in Thailand.
Can I just ask something about this different manuscript?
Yeah.
So you said that there's no identification of Cambodia as a foreigner. So what's the word used for Kamputi or Kamputi?
The words used is, well, remember this is a Thai translation.
Okay, yeah.
But I think that there's usually, due to language contact, I think there's usually Thai and Khmer words that were commonly translated back and forth as identical terms, or as almost identical terms. But usually in these texts, they're either talking about, they either refer to the kingdom as Kampuchea, or in Thai it's Kampucha Tiburi, or by the capital, which is Loet in these texts. But often when they refer to the country was the king in some ways. So most of the actions that took place in these chronicles were the king does this or the prince does that. So the main character is mostly royals or people that the kings appoint to do different things. And as I mentioned, the identity of the subjects of the king was kind of irrelevant in these texts, especially in the earlier ones. At the end, though, there's a discussion of some history of Vietnam, when Vietnam split into two states for a while, in which they use the word Yuan a lot. Okay, so this is the first example from the time of King Narrate of Ayutthaya, who invaded Cambodia in the 16th century. I think that this is where according to this text, King Narrate appointed two men from his court to disguise themselves as monks in order to appear innocent and use magic to make Cambodia weaker. In this quote, and for the rest of the text, or for the rest of this passage, this episode, there's no mention of anyone being Thai or Khmer. The second example, though, I wanted to show you that the entire text is not like that. The second example, they start to talk about Thai units, a Thai army, Muang Thai, which probably was translated from Srok Thai. And so in this case, which is further down and more later in the events of the chronicle, we start to see the ethnonym Thai, which before that was really just used to describe people. Now we start to see it being used to describe a state, Muang Thai, or an institution of the state, the army. Okay. Oh, I meant to include the quote about, or the portion about the Yuan also, but anyway, I didn't. Sorry. You can ask about it later. The third chronicle text I want to talk about now is the Nom Recension. It's about 100 pages long. It's more or less a complete history from the 14th century until the date it was composed. The first half is probably copied from older texts. The second half was probably certainly written. The second half is all about the period from 1750 until 1818. It's possibly all written in just before 1818, or it was possibly written at a few different times. However, throughout the text, both Siam and Vietnam are regularly referred to by ethnic terms, Thai and Yuan. Many dozens of times each. And I don't see any difference in the use of these ethnic terms from the first half of the text and the second half of the text, which were supposed to have been composed at different times, which makes me suspect that that the text was was at least partially revised or edited, or it was translated badly, or there were already examples of state ethnicity, references to these kingdoms as ethnic states during the composition in the mid-19th century, mid-18th century, which is also possible. However, there is a difference in the use of the ethnonym Khmer. The first half of the text does not mention Khmer at all in the history of Cambodia, while the second half of the text mentions it fairly frequently, maybe not as much as the other versions. So this is an example of using both Yuan and Khmer as state ethnicities. It says the Yuan army did battle with the Khmer army. They fought and fought, but no one lost and no one won. So the Yuan army returned to Srok Yuan. So this is a kind of passage that in all texts that we can see, they're definitely written before the 18th century. We would not have seen states or armies described ethnically like this. Okay, and finally there's the Noborot recension, which the copy date is 1878. I looked mostly at the new content that was written just probably before, sometime in the 1860s or 70s. There's constant use of ethnonyms in the narrative, much more commonly than in the other versions that I mentioned. The ethnonyms are used to describe internally diverse corporate entities like the Thai army, as we've seen. They're also applied to countries, Srok Khmer, Srok Thai, Srok Yuan, which you could say are using ethnonyms to refer now to places and states directly. And also we start to see ethnonyms as autonomous impersonal characters which drive the narrative. So for the first time we start seeing the Yuan attacked the Khmer, or the Thai, the Thai are evil, something like that. So it's referring to, or it's like a group of ethnically defined people associated with a state who act on their own. We're not talking about kings doing actions anymore. We're actually talking about ethnic groups or the subjects of a king as a social category doing actions. And so here's an example of this. All the nobles and officials, high and low, in Srok Khmer became angry. So the context is when in the 1830s and early 1840s, there was a Vietnamese governor of Phnom-Penh. The Vietnamese army occupied Phnom-Penh, and there was a Vietnamese governor, and that governor tried to weaken the Khmer royal family and exacerbate tensions in that family, partially by capturing people and sending them away to Vietnam. Partially by persuading, partially by force, partially by capturing people and so on. So after a while, according to the chronicle, the nobles and officials of Cambodia figured out what was going on, and this is how they felt. All the nobles and officials, high and low, in Srok Khmer became angry. They all felt that the Vietnamese governor's plot ordering important nobles of Srok Khmer sent to Srok Yuan, and capturing 4 lords of Srok Khmer and sending them to Srok Yuan, that the Yuan were plotting to destroy Srok Khmer's royal family. I'd like to point out that if you look at Khmer language textbook, like history textbooks today, they're written in this style, in which states are given ethnic or national categories and act as characters in the narrative. Some people blame that on colonial France, and well, France didn't make anything any better. We can also see the evidence of this earlier. This is from a couple years earlier than that. This is when the Vietnamese governor had a trick to try to capture a high-ranking Khmer official or prince, I think. And this time he had his 2 Vietnamese associates dress up as Khmer. And so I want to contrast that with the quote that I gave you at the beginning, where Ayutthaya had 2 spies dress up as monks. Actually, that was a rather common theme in early chronicles. Like, if you wanted your spies to look innocent, then they would dress up as monks. But I think it's interesting that here they're not dressing up as monks, they're disguising their ethnic identity. And I think that signals that ethnic identity meant to people a political affiliation by this point. So you couldn't be Yuan and innocent at the same time, according to this text. So the general trends that I've found and that I've tried to point out, which you could say, or which I argue, are trends in the way that chroniclists wrote about ethnic identity or made ethnic identifications in chronicles from the late or mid 18th century to the late 19th century are as follows. You see more frequent use of ethnonyms of all kinds, referring to cultural groups, referring to individuals, referring to villages, as well as to referring to state ethnicity, referring to armies, referring to kingdoms. You also see, especially you see more frequent ethnic identification of state ethnicities, making an association of the subjects of a king or the hoped for subjects of a king with that state. Third, I see an identification of other state ethnicities happen before an identification of one's own state ethnicity. So in Khmer language chronicles, we see discussions of the Thai army or the Srok Yuan before we see discussions of the Khmer army or the Srok Khmer. But still, we see the latter by the beginning of the 19th century. We start to see more frequent references to kingdoms as ethnic places. Srok Khmer, Krom Thai, Srok Yuan. More frequent use of ethnic groups as autonomous political actors in the narrative, saying the Khmer did this, the Yuan did that, the Thai did this. So those are the general trends that I found. I want to just remind you, though, that I'm only looking at chronicles here. Chronicles are a genre of writing that had certain conventions. And I'm showing how those conventions changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people who were writing poetry or people who were having conversations would have spoken about ethnicity in the same way. So, in fact, I think there might be some evidence that they didn't. And I can talk about that more in the question-answer period if you're interested. And so finally, I just want to talk a bit about the relationship between what I've shown you, what I see as identifications of state ethnicity in the chronicles of the early 19th and mid-19th centuries, and the ideas of what a nation is, which people ask me about this a lot. So I want to start off by saying that a lot of scholars commonly accept that there are certain ideals from the 20th century on, certain ideals of what a nation should be. They are never actually this way, but this is what people see them as what they should be. First, a state coextensive with an ethnic or national identity. That means the Khmer people live in Cambodia. The state of Cambodia is associated with the Khmer people. The Khmer people are associated with the state of Cambodia. Actually, there's a lot of problematic, that's an ideal. There's actually a lot of Khmer people who live outside of the state. There's people who are not considered Khmer who live in the state, and so on. It's very complicated, but there's a lot of confusion about whether Khmer is a national or an ethnic term and so on. But this is an ideal. The second is that a political community, a nation is a political community in which members feel a political kinship with each other. The idea is that anyone who sees themselves as Khmer, part of a Khmer state, would have a feeling of oneness, of kinship, of relationship with anyone else who is also a Khmer member of the Khmer state. And this is you can read more about it in a book by Ben Anderson called, what's it called? Imagine Communities. So you all know anyway. Okay. And then third, a national territory. People in a nation feel as if they have a national territory, which is reinforced by the technology of mapping. And so people can see a clear border around their country and say, this is Cambodia, or this is Thailand, or whatever. So a lot of people say, okay, so what is the difference between how Khmer people viewed themselves and other states, the people of other states in the early 19th century, and then how they did in the early 20th century? And I would say that the identification of state ethnicity, of associations between states and ethnic groups in the early 19th century pushed understandings of social groups in the direction of these ideals of the nation already by the early 19th century, but to different degrees. I think that the first point, the idea that a state should be coextensive with an ethnic or national identity, I think that could be the result, could also result from constantly discussing kingdoms and institutions of kingdoms as ethnic groups, as I've shown you today. The second, a political community in which members feel a political kinship. There's not very much evidence about how people actually felt about being Khmer and who else was Khmer in the early 19th century. But we do see evidence of these elite ideas of who should be considered Khmer as affecting commoners. For example, when courts ordered peasants to round up enemy soldiers or try to capture people from enemy villages. And so I think that there might have been some developments in common people's understandings of political ethnicity even as early as the late 18th or early 19th centuries. And then finally, a national territory reinforced by the technology of mapping. Tongtai likes to emphasize the technology of mapping, but there were other ways in which you could understand a geographically based ethnicity. And I've mentioned some of them today, using geographic or state-linked terms and linking them with ethnonyms like Srok Khmer might have influenced people to understand a certain geographic area or places ruled by the same bureaucracy speaking a similar language in political ways. But none of these ideals of nationhood were as commonly accepted or understood as or recognized as they became in the 20th century. But nevertheless, I think that the identification of ethnic groups with states in the early 19th century and mid-19th century kind of provided a foundation which facilitated nationalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. in a way that's not recognized by a lot of scholars today who see nationalism and the nation as a European import. So I'll just stop there. I'm happy to hear any, this is ongoing research, so I'm happy to hear any suggestions or corrections. I'm also happy to try to answer any questions you might have. I'm also giving my email address in case you would rather email me, that's fine also. So, thank you very much.
No, I was just speculating on what you were discussing before about the Cham.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe, because at one time, Angkor controlled like such a large geographic area, and then in a way, maybe Ayutthaya versus Phnom-Penh could have been perceived as almost kind of like a civil war, among one people. Mm-hmm. But historically, you can even see on Bayon Temple, I think, like the war with Cham. Mm-hmm. Although then I think about it and where that word comes from when people are telling you, oh, this is the war with the Cham, but
right.
The word is going to come them, it's not actually going to come to the picture. Yeah. But I'm just wondering if the Khmer at that time had already effectively separated the Cham as a different group because of the previous historical interactions they had with them back in that was in the 1100s or something that they had that interaction. And I'm not sure if it was religious or not. I don't know exactly the history of the Cham, but I think the Cham were not always Muslim. They were Hindu before. I think they converted in I don't know what century that was. But so there might not have been a religious distinction even at that point.
Yeah, even early on.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
I haven't really looked at the Angkorian period at all. And I haven't looked at inscriptions very much yet either. But I also, so it's very interesting to me how people in Angkor would have understood social categories or political relationships. I'm thinking that part of the impulse that I see in the early chronicles to avoid associating ethnic groups with kingdoms might have been because it's a characteristic shared by chronicles from a lot of Theravada Buddhist kingdoms. So I'm wondering if this is an influence from perhaps Sri Lankan chronicles or Mon chronicles, or more broadly, maybe South Asian political thought that slowly subsided over time. But if that were so, then that might not have had an impact on Angkor at all. It might have come after. So I'm not sure what I would find or what we would find. Maybe you will know more about the inscriptions, Angkorian inscriptions, than I do. But yeah, I'm curious to know how political communities or ethnic communities were understood in those times as well.
Hi. I great talk and great work. I'm really glad you're doing this kind of work. It reminds me of conversations I had with my teacher. My teacher was Charles Kais, and he was a specialist in Thailand, but also worked on the theory of ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And he was of the school that you should only use the term ethnicity to refer to modern peoples, mm-hmm. And which is some theory. And I always found that, I still don't totally agree with that. But I had conversations with him about it, and I asked him, how do you refer to people?
Yeah.
And he said, well, just the peoples is fine. And in a way, his work is consistent with yours, and he would not have said that ethnicity was construction of colonialism. That he would say was it came in the context of modernity. And the way that's consistent with yours is we've seen this process for modernity, the rise of nation process. And that's what's so fascinating. And, obviously, you worked in great detail about your categorizations that it's the early ones that are interesting and more problematic, of course, that obviously they didn't use the word ethnicity or ethnic. They maybe would have used the word peoples too. And with in the case of the Cham or the Hui, you said, well, they were clearly not related, connected with the state, in that sense they were ethnic. But, the question is, and I know you thought about this carefully, is how, to what extent are we, with the earlier categories, are we projecting our own ideas of ethnicity onto the terminology when people refer to the Cham or the Hui in the earlier concepts?
Yeah, the issue of what exactly am I talking about is difficult, and I've wrestled with it. I thought about, should I be using the word ethnicity at all? And I've also found that there's not a good alternative. That they're using peoples is too broad of a category because there are also a lot of references to people of certain places. The people of the capital, or the people of the hills, or so on, which also could be considered peoples as well. I found that I haven't seen this in Khmer sources yet, so I'll be looking for it. But in Thai sources, there's clearly a need. By the early 19th century, there was clearly a need to talk about ethnicity in abstract terms in a lot of Thai texts, because you see writers struggling with how to talk about ethnicity without having a word for it. There's a translation of a French treaty from the 17th century in which I haven't tracked down the original French version yet, so I'm not sure if it's a translation of the word nation or race or people or what. But the Thai decided to translate it as chat, which it comes from the Pali term jati, which is which refers to in a Buddhist sense, it refers to a life, a rebirth. But in common Thai usage at the time, it referred to any sort of assumed to be kind of natural social category. So you would have the chat category of royalty, or the chat category of certain kind of men or women, or even of certain professions. But they didn't use that term they didn't use that term regularly to refer to ethnic groups until they started using it in the first Thai text that I can find that uses chat to refer to ethnic groups, which, if anyone knows Thai, you know that chat now refers to nation, is the definition of nation now in Thai. And the related word in Khmer, I think, jiet, right? It's also used to refer to nation in Khmer. And I start to see references to using the word chat in Thai to political ethnic categories in the late 18th century, and they become more common in the early 19th century. But we also have other words which certain writers also use to refer to ethnicity, or what seems to be ethnicity. For example, pet, which now refers to gender, or pasa, which means language. And those two words are also, alongside with chat, used to talk about groups which sometimes were considered social groups, sometimes linguistic groups, sometimes political groups, which later all came to be kind of combined into the nation, into the idea of the nation. So I think that while there is no abstract, for the earlier text, there's no abstract term to refer to ethnicity, there was in the later text. I also, from the perspective of some theorists, ethnicity theorists, who prefer to see ethnicity as as a very flexible or ambiguous, potentially ambiguous concept. They also use a broader definition, so they don't understand ethnic terms as only a modern occurrence. And so I agree that I don't think that there's a fine line between pre-modern and modern, in which suddenly a new set of ideas came into being from scratch. But I see it as something of a progression, and that's despite changes of regimes in Cambodia and Thailand and so on. Does that make sense? That kind of is a disorganized answer. But well, the short answer is that it's a confusing. It's confusing and it's not clear to me as much as anyone. So it's not an easy question to answer.
Thank you very much for the conference. It reminds me a conference given by patron-client, a German researcher in Paris a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And it was a little bit about, but I don't remember what the purpose was. I think it was Khmer, for sure it was, Lao. Lao manuscripts. I don't exactly remember the purpose. I think it was the same period.
Okay.
But what was interesting is that the difference was not between state and non-state ethnonyms. It was more around Buddhist and non-Buddhist people. And the second comment, anyway, if you look at the word Sasna, which is now world religion, and Sa, Sa, I don't know if this distinction exists in Thai, but in Khmer of Sasna and Sa, all has meant for years and for centuries, so not religion, not religious group, but more. There was a notion of ethnicity also in Sa. It's used in text. So the evolution, you mentioned Cham, is it the Thai pronunciation? Tiet, Jati, and Sa has also very much involved in the sense of national membership or affiliation. So, in the old dictionaries, especially in the French Khmer dictionaries from the beginning of the 20th century, you still have the mention of Sa as an ethnic group.
Yes,
another side of the.
I would love to.
Same analysis.
Yeah, I would love to find examples of that in early texts. I haven't yet, but I haven't looked at. Okay. Yeah, I think I have seen the early 20th century. Okay. I'll look it up.
About the use of ethnonyms in, I think it was Buddhist manuscripts from the 19th century.
Okay.
Anyway, he has the text of the conference.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for everything. Just to jump on that, you have Prearin Chulsa, which was the name of the king of Phnom-Penh, first, second, I can't remember. Anyway, 16th century Khmer king, but who entered Islam. So basically, he married a Cham or Chpir woman. Basically, there is this idea that Chulsa meant that he was not only converting to Islam, but he was also switching and getting married into another group, and therefore, I think, to go back on Anne's idea, going into another group, whether we call it social, whether we call it ethnic, whether we call it religious. It was this whole idea, and also because he was marrying a she, he had to leave his group to go to her group, so he had to do that, and so that's from that period of time that the Khmer royal court has some Cham outfits and Cham regalia in the royal palace. And so that's one example, just to go back on the Sak, but also...
Say that last part about, again,
sorry, that they have, so for example, the long robe that the king wears, that's basically from that time period. That's which, when the king converted to Islam, he adopted a more Cham, Malayu outfit. So in the Chronicles, it's described as Malayu, but we don't know whether the woman was Cham or whether she was from another Muslim ethnic group. Basically, that was the idea. And so we can talk about that.
Yeah, I would be interested in
it. On the Cham case, of course, when you were wondering why they called them Cham and not referring to a specific kingdom, I was wondering because of the time frame. And I don't know, maybe I really want to add up to that later on, but the Cham were already in the country, a lot of them, and they were already making trouble, quote unquote, as the Khmer Royal Chronicles often emphasize. And so basically, as such, they might have been described as a Cham group of Cambodia. So basically, when the Cham Chronicle mentioned, and there was a war with the Chams, maybe they're not talking about the Cham from outside of the border. Maybe they're probably, more likely, they're talking about the Chams within the country, but often allied with one king or one prince, and another group would ally with another prince. And therefore, you would have this tension between not only two ethnic groups, but really different little groups within those ethnic groups fighting each other, basically to have their king coming into power. And of course, the losing ones would be called rebels, while the winning ones would be just, inserted in the royal palace and within the army groups. And that's why all through the centuries, you see the Chams being very powerful and very prominent in the army in Cambodia, still now, even if they are using sometimes some Khmer names.
Thank you. Yeah, I will take a look at the particular episodes you're talking about again. It is a very interesting time period when the king converted to Islam. There was also a lot of interactions with Europeans at the time as well, or a little bit earlier, I think. Part of the difficulty with working with chronicles is that because there's lots of versions of Cambodia's chronicles, sometimes it's difficult to tell which parts of the chronicles were written when, or rewritten when. And for the later chronicles, the main ones used today, but the ones that are after the ones that I talked about today, there's a lot of oral history that was added to the chronicles in the late 19th century. So using those later chronicles, it's very difficult to tell where the information comes from, unless you can compare it to an earlier version of the chronicle, earlier chronicle version. But even earlier chronicle versions won't answer every question because there were different chronicle traditions that might have included different kinds of content. So, I mean, some of the stories that you can read about in the later chronicles, to me they're interesting, but I'm reluctant to take them. Well, I'm reluctant to use them as evidence of anything that people were thinking or wanted to say from before they were written, because I don't want to, just like I'm trying to avoid bringing my biases to looking at the older content, I also don't want biases from 20th century Cambodia to influence how I look at earlier time periods. But certainly I will take a look at both of the examples that you mentioned again, and hopefully, if I can find earlier texts that talk about, early 19th century or before texts that talk about that king's conversion or about the Cham in general, I'd love to see it. And I've seen a little bit, but I think there's probably more that I haven't seen yet. As far as the Cham people making trouble, having lived in the Kingdom of Cambodia for a long time and sometimes being referred to as having been troublemakers, they're also often referred, as you know, they're also often referred to as high ministers of state in Cambodia and nobles and being important people. You mentioned their role in the military, but they had other roles too, official roles. So, but that this particular example could be a reference to maybe a rebellion. I think it's possible. The wording that they use makes me think that it's talking about outside people, because it's the lord. I think they use Jiao in Thai, which is the Jiao, Jiao, which refers to a particular town or place or kingdom, but non-specifically. But it seems like it's somewhere else, or somewhere outside of the main area of Cambodia. But if there had been a rebellion in Cambodia, they would have treated it more or less similarly, I think. So I'll take a look at it again with that in mind, and maybe I'll read it differently.
I have a question. I wonder how the political relation between the Khmer and the Thai at the time play out in this, the way that all these chronicles might have been written at the time. Because during this period, as you said, even though we don't know exactly, especially for the Khmer Chronicle, when it was written, or when maybe it was divided and rewritten, all this. But given this time frame, after the Angkor period up to the French period, we call it as really, to me, a survival period for the Khmer. And the Khmer was in a huge influence of the Thai, especially because at that time it was really, under a lot of influence from the Yuan as well. But I wonder if when you read the text, how this political, unequal political relation between the two political organization or political entity play out in this.
Okay, thank you. So for the history of the relationship between Siam, Ayutthaya, and Cambodia from, say, the 14th, 15th, early 16th century, in his dissertation, Michael Vickery, that's the subject of his dissertation. And in short, he finds that during historical periods when the relationship between the two kingdoms became more important, specifically the 18th century, he finds that episodes in the prior history, the old history, were kind of inserted into the chronicles. Like suddenly we need to understand our relationship better. Let's look to the history, and then the historians would say, well, we don't really have a history, but we can kind of guess that this is probably what happened, and maybe we can take a story that we don't know what the date is, and we can put it here, or we can take a story that happened later, and maybe we got the dates wrong and change things around. So there's a lot of confusion about episodes in both Thai and Khmer Chronicles in the older history of the relationship between the two kingdoms. And in fact, a lot of the material was borrowed from the Thai Chronicles into the Khmer Chronicles, and maybe put back. But it was, for the parts that we can say are, for the later history, maybe from the 17th century on, we can see a transition in understanding the relationship between the two kingdoms as between the personal relationships of the two kings, usually with Ayutthaya or Bangkok as king as being more powerful, and the Cambodian king is less powerful. But sometimes, if Bangkok or Ayutthaya was weak, then their relative power might be different. But it was personalized. It was like this king felt like this towards that king, or he did something personal to make him angry, or the king of Cambodia saw that Siam was looking weak, so he attacked, or vice versa. And then, as I talked about today, by the early 19th century, it starts to be referred to the Khmer Chronicles started to refer to both Siam and Vietnam as ethnic kingdoms. One thing that I didn't talk very much today about is the ability to use ethnonyms as a basis for stereotypes. When you start to talk about all of the people of your enemy state as being in the same social category, then you can start to make associations between those people or about those people. Associations which could be connected to people who don't know each other. For example, if you started talking about how the Thai people cannot be trusted in the Chronicles, right? Then you can start to say, well, we had stories about relationships with the Thai people 200 years ago, and 200 years ago they couldn't be trusted. And now they still can't be trusted. Before, in the older Chronicles, when everything was personal, you couldn't do that. Because everything was about this king and that king. So if that king dies, then you have to renegotiate the relationship. But if you're starting to talk about kingdoms as ethnic, then suddenly they become long-lasting. And something that happened 200 years ago, the Yuan did this, 200 years ago, you can still blame them today. And so that's another transformation that I didn't talk about much today, but there's enough evidence for it in these early chronicles that you can see it.
Yes, we haven't spoken much about what we call in French racialisation. I mean, the word race in English and in French has definitely not the same meaning. But what we call race in France is more about biological identity. So in this, the modern meaning of today, there is something about the race, I mean, biological dimension of identity. So the particular moment, historical moment when appear to be more about something about biological race. Should be also, it has to do with stereotype also. So people having a particular physical appearance and having all those, the words about during the Ronald program about you have all this interplay between the mind, the body, and so on. And maybe I remember what Penny Edwards said right in the book about the very moment where the Thai were the first, before the Khmer, I don't remember what was to say that when Kiet Hatsa Sasna became a new definition of what a nation is. And this is also we mentioned two authors here. It's also speak about Renan. The Renan's definition of what a nation is.
Sorry, who?
Renan, Ernest Renan.
Okay, you can tell me later. Thank you.
18th century text, very famous one. 19th century text about what a nation is. So you need a people, a race, a territory, political power. So it's even more. But I'm sure you did it actually, of course, in PhD, but more sophisticated and more English word, sophisticated approach of what we call state ethnicity, which has dimensions. But I'm sure
I think it's.
you do that in
I think it's ironic that as classification has become more sophisticated, it's also gotten more confusing.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure if it's helped matters at all, if it's helped anyone and actually understand what's going on, which I think may be part of the reason. If people don't understand why or how they're being classified, or if people understand it differently, then a lot of advantage can be taken by people who can manipulate identities. I tend to agree with people who think of these social categories, of ethnic social categories, as, well, as I mentioned, constructed and flexible. But they can also be multiple. There can be, you can be, by which I mean it could include what we might think of ethnicity and race and nation as all similar kinds of social categories. So at one time you can be, you can be both American and Khmer, for example. American is defined slightly differently than Khmer, popularly and officially. But there's a lot of, in people's day-to-day interactions, some people have some flexibility in how they represent themselves. So to me, I see race as a different kind of ethnicity, one that uses markers that include an idea of biological inheritance. But I'm not an expert on 20th century history, and I don't know much about the process of nation making here in Cambodia, or anywhere for that matter. So, but I'd like to read more about the author you suggested. But what's his name? The author. Can you spell the last name?
R-E-N-A-N. I'm sure the text has been translated.
Ernest.
E-R-N-E-S-T.
Thank you. Okay.
Is there a defining moment in history when the term Yuan became slurred? Because you mentioned that it was there in the Chronicles, so why do we use it today as a pejorative or as an insult that we're trying to sort of to be politically correct? So is there a moment in time when it became widespread that this has to be very, very
I don't know. I think it probably happened. It probably happened slowly, and it probably happened after the period that I've looked at. Probably the early mid 20th century. I don't know, but certainly, as I was saying, that you started to see written into chronicles disparaging references to, attached to ethnic terms. I meant, in one of the examples, I don't know if you noticed, when somebody is referred to as via, the pronoun via, it, right? As sort of a lowly term, and that was associated with the ethnic term Yuan in a political context. And so I start to see examples of connections between the ethnonyms and kind of insulting terminology, or just even calling Yuan the enemy Yuan all the time. If you repeat the enemy Yuan many, many times, then people start to say, "Oh, those people are our enemies," And so you can see the building blocks of it, I think, in some of these chronicles texts, but I don't think it became as widespread until later.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I'm very interested in your conference. I have another small one. So you did mention, because this is a Thai manuscript, we would see in Khmer, which is far more common than Thai. So is there any difference? The manuscript of Thai, so maybe the word used for Thai is Thai,
Right.
No. But is there any equivalent of Siam? Because there is Yuan, but the traditional word for Thai people is Siam and not Thai. So of course the Thai word, the mention of Thai is more, for me, has a more national connotation than Siam.
Yeah.
It refers to a national state.
Thank you for that, because I will look at it again, because I want to see that. That's a good question, and I want to see what they say.
Because in the another discussion with the talk, but in the Royal Chronicle, that small bits that are able to read, it's Siam is always mentioned. There is no mention of Thai. As late as the early 20th century.
My understanding right now is that it was a name for the kingdom rather than a name for the specific people. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be used to kind of imply people as well. But I will look at it again. That's an interesting question. I'd like to know. Awesome.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming and asking this question.